recited Gramps' chess puzzle over and over to make himself fall asleep. The second time, he'd brushed it off as a coincidence and watched a video on his phone about robots. But on the third night, as nothing moved out in the street, Lewis had felt the sudden urge to open one of his eyes just a scratch. There it was again, silhouetted against the curtains in the orange streetlight. When it happened for a fourth time and then a fifth, Lewis had used Mum's packing tape to seal the curtains to the windowsill. That way, he couldn't see out, and nothing outside could see in. But, like clockwork, only moments after midnight, he'd heard a faint chick-chick-chick. Even in the stuffiness of the car, Lewis felt the skin around his ribs quiver as he remembered it tapping against the glass. Its beak was too pale to be a crow's. He could tell it wasn't a raven because he'd seen loads of them up close on their school trip to the Tower of London. And there was nothing in the copy of Flycatchers and Coal Tits, a fascinating exploration of English passerines, which he'd found underneath their coffee table. But it wasn't the dark, oily feathers, armour-like claws, or even its size that made the bird seem so unusual. It was the eyes. Dad flicked on the wipers as a sudden flurry of rain scattering across the windscreen made the towering crags passing the car look wild and hairy. "Shall we play a game?" Mum asked brightly, twisting round in her seat. 20 questions, or how about a good old-fashioned round of I Spy? But before he could reply, Lewis caught Dad's eye in the rear-view mirror. "Do I detect some revision going on back there?" Dad asked, giving him a look that was halfway between surprised and impressed. A guilty pang tucked into Lewis's stomach. Physics," he murmured, gripping the pages as his eyes darted to the textbook. Dad nodded slowly. "Okay. Do you think maybe you should be focusing on biology? That's where you got let down by—" "George," Mum said in a low voice, "just let him be, okay? It's moving day." His biology results weren't his best, but they hadn't let him down, had they? Dad hunched his shoulders slightly, as if he'd been told off. And in the silence, an unwelcome thought that Lewis was far too familiar with burrowed like a woodworm through his head. What happens if I don't get in? He didn't care about it for himself. He couldn't give a hoot about going to a posh school. It was Dad he was worried about. What would he say? Would he be all quiet and disappointed again? Lewis hated when Dad was quiet, because even though for the past 2 months Dad hadn't stopped rabbiting on about study planners and how avocados could help you focus, Lewis knew that Dad talking made him feel loads better than Dad saying nothing at all, which had been the case a lot since Gramps had died 6 months ago. "Dad," Lewis asked. "Uh-huh." Lewis began, trying to sound casual. "There's loads of houses that you can sell in Barrow, aren't there?" Mum gave Dad a very hurried glance. "Oh, yeah," Dad said with a dismissive little laugh. "Buckets of them." "Hey, and don't you worry about me either." Mum twisted round again. "Dentists always land on their feet because there's always someone in every town on the planet that doesn't brush their teeth." Lewis forced a smile. Mum was always so jolly with her crinkly eyes and short pixie-ish hair. "And there's a school?" asked Lewis quietly as his fingers played with the lock on his door. "A school?" Dad frowned a little. "You mean Ilksbridge?" "No, I mean a normal school, like in the town." "There is," Dad said slowly, "but it's just the local school where me and your auntie went when we grew up in Barrow. Why?" Lewis stared out of the window again. "I could always go there, couldn't I?" he asked quietly. In the front, Dad adjusted the little pine-shaped air freshener. "If, for some reason, Ilksbridge didn't work out," Lewis added quietly. "Hey," Dad said softly, and Lewis's eyes flitted to the rear-view mirror once more. "You're going to get that scholarship." Lewis pushed up against the headrest and let out a slow breath as his cheeks flushed. "And if you don't," Mum added, "then I'll just think that Ilksbridge is a ridiculous school, that they're nitwits for not seeing how brilliant you are, and that you're better off without them anyway." "Oh, June, please," Dad sighed as if this were a disgraceful thing to say. "If it's so great, why didn't you go to Ilksbridge when you grew up in Barrow, Dad?" Lewis asked. "Gramps worked as a cleaner at Marlow Hall and he couldn't afford the school," Dad said, waving his hand dismissively. "We could never afford this school," Mum reminded them. "Then why didn't you apply for